With the brief artillery barrage that had ignited combat at the stroke of midnight, as the artillery battalion within the 1st Brigade responsible for the Odessa half of the Midland-Odessa battle space, as the 2nd Brigade was responsible for the Midland half of the Midland-Odessa primary campaign battle space, both comprising the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, along with the Headquarters and Headquarters Company and Service Support Company at the division level. The 1st Brigade's Artillery Battalion let off a thunderous volley of 130mm howitzer shells coming from within the Artillery Battalion with its Type 59-I or -1 howitzer battery and the 6 additional howitzer batteries comprised of the Type 83 towed 122mm howitzers, having had acquired data from the massive surveillance apparatus as the ISR capabilities of the coalition were effectively ironclad. The FDC elements within each firing battery, as each firing platoon had its own FDC elements, was receiving their fire missions from the real-time AI battlefield data combat system, or effectively the Sino-Russian AI combat cloud, allowing for these forces to conduct pinpoint artillery strikes on all of their targets throughout the battle space, as the confused and panicked armed reactionary civilians, having had emerged from their homes, many of them with weapons in hands, became instant targets of the People's Armed Police artillery as a very short but very potent artillery barrage had landed on their neighborhood within the West Odessa suburb of the city of Odessa proper, as the armed reactionary civilians coming out in clusters from their residences were seen as a major threat to the flanks of the People's Armed Police combat battalions, especially the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion, who had to pass through the area en route to their primary objectives in the north of the city of Odessa, namely the 106th Brigade Support Battalion, the chief logistical force from within the larger 155th Armored Brigade combat team, now posted to the National Guard Armory, as well as the Alpha Company, which was a tank company, which was part of the 1st of the 635th Armored Battalion, also part of the 155th Armored Brigade combat team. These forces, after the brief artillery barrage from the Artillery Battalion of the 1st Brigade of the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division, let loose a massive volley of shells raining down on these 2 targets in the north of the city of Odessa, effectively the Alpha Company on the local municipal airport, as well as the nearby National Guard Armory hosting the 106th Brigade Support Battalion, as massive quantities of 130mm and 122mm shells landed in the area. The artillery would soon come to support other operations occurring in the Odessa side of the battle space at large, as the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion tasked with eradicating the U.S. military forces located in the north of the city of Odessa, essentially the National Guardsmen. The Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion was very nearly tasked with the clearance of their own flanks as this threat emerged. However, they effectively would continue on to their primary objective as the threat to their flanks would dissipate, as many of the armed reactionary civilian personnel that were coming out of the neighborhoods in West Odessa from their residences were effectively workers at an industrial/office mixed development area located immediately on the southern fringes of West Odessa, essentially where the oil reclamation plant lay, which was a primary objective of the nearby armored battalion, also part of the 1st Brigade of the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division, who was tasked with moving in to secure this facility intact and surgically doing so with a high degree of precision in the process, as the armed reactionary civilian cluster of roughly 600 plus personnel, as it was a bit over the number of 600, had all fled in a sort of herd mentality, as many of the armed civilians followed others as they fled the neighborhood looking for more defensive positions to the south, as this industrial site was seen by many as easier to defend than was their suburban neighborhood. As these were reactionary armed civilians, they were effectively reacting to the invasion, as they had no centralized leadership, no logistical capabilities to speak of in order to resupply and maintain long-term defensive operations. They had no actionable intelligence from which they could form coherent defensive plans. They had no organization, no coordination, and no cohesion. It was effectively a free-for-all, and the panic that ensued as artillery had wiped out dozens of armed civilians emerging from their home caused the remainder to flee south. As they fled into this area, on their heels was the soon-to-arrive armored battalion of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division's 1st Brigade, as they moved first on the rural roads through the outskirts of West Odessa. They soon came to I-20 and effectively moved along I-20 on the access road through this mixed industrial / business area. As the armor inched ever closer, they would arrive by 12:45 a.m., or 45 minutes into the nationwide invasion on October the 4th, as the tandem anti-sat cyber strikes and the local usage of electronic warfare jamming assets aboard the Y-9LG electronic warfare / electronic intelligence aircraft orbiting this battle space essentially took down all available forms of communications and even ISR capabilities in the form of drones that the civilians even had access to at the commercial level. As all of these capabilities were essentially knocked offline, the ISR apparatus of the coalition was simply a monstrosity in terms of its overall size and capabilities compared to the Stone Age level that the Americans would effectively have to operate within during the course of this 4-day-long invasion, as they had lost everything while the coalition had every single solitary advantage imaginable. As the armed civilians, some of which had thought of what they would do if the country had been invaded, many having fantasies of fighting off the invasion at their front door or in their driveway or even by their mailbox, as many had thought, the reality was very far removed from the fantasy, and now that they had lost all communication, they couldn't organize a cohesive defense, which would lead to friendly fire incidences, as again it would be more of a free-for-all, as different groupings of armed civilians working together would end up shooting other groupings that were essentially not aware of their presence in certain areas, assuming wrongly that they were the enemy in the distance. As they fled into this built-up industrial / business area, which would effectively contain the key objective, which was the oil reclamation plant, as well as also the oil valve business next door to the west, immediately west, as well as a sanitation and waste truck business, and also oil company offices, all located in the same industrial / business park as the oil reclamation plant. Also, there were restaurants in the area, and even north, there was an RV park along I-20 where the coalition forces would be moving along the access road to effectively move underneath I-20 on Moss Avenue, which would become Meteor Crater Drive. As we go to the map of the local area in question, as many of these personnel, as mentioned before, worked in this area or had worked in this area previously and seen it as more defensible than their suburban neighborhood, they fled rapidly into this area, arriving between 12:30 a.m. and 12:45 a.m., by which point the armored battalion's forces will have entered this particular area. As two combat companies of the 7 deployed of the battalion, with its headquarters and support company remaining behind on their CCP regime property to manage logistics and command and support the operation from there, as it was the command and logistical element over the entire battalion. It also contained their combat drone section, which operated their TEL-based system for the CH-901A loitering munitions. They would launch their initial salvo of 48 of these devastating kamikaze drones equipped with fragmentation warheads. As they were not up against any sort of armored opponent, these fragmentation warheads were more than enough to eliminate clusters of dismounted infantry type personnel or even destroy their technicals as well, as it was effective not only against groupings of dismounts but also against soft-skinned civilian and or military vehicles. In this case, the trucks, SUVs, and even some of the personal cars utilized by these militia or these armed reactionary civilians, rather, would be counted as technicals of sorts. But it could also be said that these armed reactionary civilians were vastly different in their capabilities when compared to their much better organized, much better led, and much better equipped armed civilian militia brethren, as there were 7 major militias located in the area. Not all of the armed civilians were part of these militias, and in this particular battle, it would effectively be a battle against the vastly well-equipped People's Armed Police shock forces, as this was a quasi-elite paramilitary shock force, effectively the CCP regime's answer to the German Waffen-SS of World War II fame. These forces entering the area with their vastly better organization, weapons, and logistical capabilities, as well as their vast technological edge and superiority, would move in and effectively annihilate this poorly organized, led, and supplied force. It would even be the case that many of the armed reactionary civilians in question would run out of ammunition while facing off against the People's Armed Police. Some would even try to surrender and would be eliminated in the process, as these industrial/office areas would be raided by the People's Armed Police shock forces. These areas would essentially be separated by different types of walls and fencing to include concrete T-walls, which made extremely effective cover and concealment for the armed reactionary civilian forces on the ground. However, these could, of course, be destroyed by the heavy weapons possessed by the PAP, or they could even be effectively crossed by People's Armed Police using their grappling and rappelling methods to breach certain areas in order to clear them, as the People's Armed Police had a distinct tactical advantage and a highly aggressive tempo of operations and fighting. The People's Armed Police would gradually sweep the area of any and all armed resistance, as again, the quality of the armed reactionary civilians varied, with some actually coming equipped for proper combat with body armor, Kevlar helmets, or even at the lower end, simple plate carriers. The vast majority of them, however, were not properly equipped for combat and simply came in their civilian attire with whatever magazines and ammunition they could carry on their person, which would only last a relatively short amount of time. Again, they were not logistically as prepared as their militia brethren, although some did have ammo cans and also bags of ammunition and other quantities of ammunition in certain containers. This would not be enough to fight off the People's Armed Police in this battle. However, that's not to say that the armed reactionary civilians wouldn't put up the best fight imaginable, as they were literally fighting for their own very lives. Their hodgepodge of different small arms would simply not be enough to contend with the powerful armored vehicles possessed by the People's Armed Police, as they would assault the area with their Type 62G, or Gai, which means improved in Mandarin Chinese, light tanks, as well as also their potent Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles and their Type 63 armor personnel carriers coming equipped with heavy machine guns. Effectively, the 12.7 millimeter W-85 heavy machine guns would be utilized alongside of the powerful 30mm autocannons and even 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine guns on the infantry fighting vehicles, as well as even the option to utilize their shorter range HJ-73C anti-tank guided missile against certain targets, and would be heavily supported by their own battalion's combat drone section, launching a volley, a salvo of 48 loitering munitions. These loitering munitions, however, due to the vast quantity of armed reactionary civilians spread out throughout the battle space, would not be enough in and of themselves to eliminate all of them. However, as this was a target-rich environment, it would require the combination of the drone-based firepower along with the vehicle-based firepower on land, and, of course, the dismounted PAP troops to sweep and clear these industrial areas. By 12:45 a.m., at the start of the battle, as these armed civilians had fled their neighborhoods, as there were still many thousands of civilians milling about in the area, some armed, some not. These were the reactionary civilians that fled into this area, and this area, again, happened to be a major objective that needed to be cleared in a highly surgical manner, as it originally had been effectively tasked to the light mechanized infantry battalion to clear their own flanks en route to their objectives. Now they were redirected to their objectives as these armed civilians had fled. They could largely ignore most of the unarmed civilians and whatever armed civilians were hiding about the area, as they were no longer a threat, and they raced to their objective, while the armored battalion would be tasked with the clearance of their own objective, as these forces would be highly supported later by artillery, as initially the artillery would spend its first 30 minutes pounding military targets in the north of Odessa before reorienting their firepower to support the next major objective, which was the capture and clearance of the ICE detention center, which was to become a Laogai, or forced labor camp, as well as the absolute and total annihilation of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, as this battalion, also part of the larger 155th Armor Brigade combat team, needed to be destroyed along with the paramilitary alphabet personnel defending this particular detention center, as the artillery would support this operation and even give heavy support later to fend off the strongest militia force in this region, sending a strike force to attack the very headquarters and support battalion over the entire 1st Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division. This could not be permitted to stand, as this battalion was absolutely critical for logistics and command over the entire the 1st Brigade, which was over the entire Odessa side or western half of the Midland and Odessa battle space. However, 2 firing batteries would be able to support the clearance of the oil reclamation plant area with highly surgical and precise artillery shell fires from their Type 59-I or -1 howitzer battery within the battalion, as well as a single battalion of the 6 Type 83 122mm howitzer battalions also joining in. Air power would also be called in to support the operation in the form of initially one airstrike from the Iranian Air Force's contributed squadron of Su-24 strike aircraft. One such strike aircraft would be called in to carry out an airstrike to fix in place the Americans inside this large compound in order to prevent them from fleeing, so that they could be fixed in place to be surgically annihilated by the PAP shock troops entering the area. Later in this operation, a PLAAF, or Chinese Air Force JH-7, would also carry out a heavy strike against remaining forces on the map, as there would be American armed reactionary civilians utilizing natural terrain features to effectively dig in and defend themselves against the direct fire coming from the PAP's light tanks, as the light tank company assisting in this assault would be largely charged with eliminating this particular threat in the southeast quadrant of the map. If we go to the battle space, within this 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south battle space, armed reactionary civilians entering this area earlier will have moved to a deserty field in the southeast quadrant of this map, which contained 4 oil derricks and an oil storage container, and many natural terrain features, some of which extremely deep crevices, wadis, and washouts in the earth, allowing them to take proper cover from direct fire from the light tanks for a time, except for when they protruded their heads over these areas where they could be destroyed. However, because they were only equipped with small arms, all they could effectively do was try to aim for the turret machine gunners aboard the light tanks, who, by this point, would be constantly laying down heavy fire upon their targets in the field, as these light tanks would also have 180-degree fields of fire, which interlocked, enabling 2 light tanks to mutually support one another at a single time. As the light tanks would enter the area, as the light tank company was the first to cross underneath I-20, would move south along First Moss Avenue before it became Meteor Crater Road, where they would continue to the south, in effect to block any possible eastward escape from this battle space, as well as even a southward escape, as the lead light tanks with their fields of fire could cut off any fleeing personnel trying to flee the battle space, while the similar effect of the follow-up armored infantry company entering the battle space would move through the area headed first westward, where they would gradually dismount their 3 combat platoons, enabling them to sweep and clear out the entire oil reclamation plant and its surrounding environs with heavy support from their combat drone section, as well as also later artillery, as the armored infantry battalion moved west, gradually deploying all 3 of its combat platoons. It would then turn and gradually move south through the oil valve plant and gradually continue on until they had fields of fire that could cut off any westward escape and southward escape. Of course, to the north would remain the additional companies of the battalion, with a follow-up light tank company on the I-20 access road to cut off any type of possible assistance or any type of retreat by any fleeing armed reactionary civilians from this area, as the remaining combat battalions, in addition to the 3 on the map, were further back. They could be called in if need be. However, it would not be necessary, as these 2 combat companies of the battalion, with the remaining combat companies off map, could handle this situation single-handedly, especially with all of the support they would receive from the air and artillery, not to mention, of course, their loitering munition strikes coming in immediately at the opening of this map. As it was 12:45 as the map opens up, heavy small arms fire was being exchanged with the heavy machine gun, frag T shell, and HE shell fire coming from the light tanks back and forth against the entrenched armed reactionary civilian personnel. As the rest had fled into the industrial and office areas, they were utilizing everything conceivably possible with which to take cover behind, which included storage containers or connexes, or effectively shipping containers that were littered throughout the area, as well as heavy equipment and parked vehicles, as well as also short concrete walls around certain facilities, and of course even concrete T-walls. There were of course other types of walls, such as flimsy metal paneled walls and even chain link fencing in certain areas. However, these walls made no good cover and concealment, as in this animation or illustration by this building with these garage doors. A loitering munition strike has taken out multiple personnel with a fragmentation warhead, even ripping through this flimsy metal paneled fencing and wiping these 2 out, as the quadcopter assets at the squad and vehicle crew level were mapping out the area in real time as a massive portion of the overall ISR capabilities. They were also added to the massive ISR capabilities even above these, which were the high-altitude reconnaissance drones, and even above them satellite, all interlocking to map the ever-fluid, modern-changing battlefield in real time, plotting friendly and enemy positions as they moved by the literal second. As the Sino-Russian AI combat cloud effectively crunched data by the millisecond in various domains and effectively gave responses in a feedback loop to the combat data links, this enabled the coalition forces to know every terrain feature and every building layout and effectively allow them to plan their operations and tactics accordingly, giving them a masterful edge over the entire battlefield. The Americans, no longer having any ISR or communications capabilities, would suffer immensely for this, as they were seen moving in real time, and the coalition forces could plan their attacks accordingly, as the Americans were effectively blind and in the dark, proverbially speaking, and very literally, as it was after midnight when this invasion had begun. These forces running to and fro again would even cause friendly fire incidences. Many of them didn't even possess night vision or IR equipment, and it was difficult for them to see one another in the blackout conditions. However, despite the friendly fire, these forces would still put up the best resistance possible against their attackers, who had, again, every single solitary advantage against them in these conditions. As the light tank company that entered under I-21st would slowly move southward in their staggered column vehicle formation with all interlocking fields of fire and mutual support. Their headquarters platoon got into a defensive star formation with their EQ-2050, which was their company captain's vehicle, which was China's answer to the up-armored Humvee, along with their Tiger MRAPs in a protective star formation, defended the weaker, soft-skinned, and support vehicles of the platoon, including their armored ambulance, their Fall MV3 fueler, which was their fuel truck for their company, as well as their Type 84 armored recovery vehicle and their 4 Shangji supply trucks. As the armored infantry company moved in to begin to clear the area, their lead platoon in a wedge formation, as their company entered in a rolling arrow with their lead platoon in a wedge formation, like so, with their point vehicle, of course, being their infantry fighting vehicle, their Type 86G. They had already deployed the squads of their first platoon from their vehicles, and as they moved into the area, 2 platoons would clear alongside of these rail tracks, as this was a freight rail line, according to the brown color coding, as the passenger rail is mauve color coding, this being I-20, the I-20 two-access roads, and this being Murphy Street, as the armored infantry company moves slowly into the area along Murphy Street. These 2 squads, led by a wedge formation squad, followed up by a staggered column formation squad, also moved in a rolling arrow and would eventually get into contact with these armed reactionary civilians deployed from their technical from the back, with 3 more remaining in the technical, one standing in the bed to offer up fire and the others in the cab. These personnel would be wiped out rapidly by the heavy firepower of the People's Armed Police dismounts, as well as the support they would receive from their infantry fighting vehicle and also their armored personnel carriers with their 12.7 millimeter W85 heavy machine guns. As they took fire immediately, indicated by the cyan color coding on the red on the dots, which were individual soldiers. They returned fire with a rocket-propelled grenade, a Type 69, which destroyed the vehicle, utilizing the anti-armor rocket instead of the anti-personnel ammunition. They destroyed this technical and would continue to lay down small arms fire against the remaining dismounts, while their vehicles slowly moved into position. As these squads had dismounted, the 3 additional squads of the lead platoon from their vehicles, they were beginning to clear the buildings on the site of the sanitation/waste truck business, as they had already wiped these personnel out who had exited this building utilizing small arms fire and heavy machine gun fire from their armored personnel carrier when it was in this position here, supporting them. They moved along these buildings to allow for the machine gun fire to hit this area, to splash through this area, while they too laid down and vectored their fire in an L vector of fire, quickly cutting down these personnel who fled from this building, trying to reach this building. Additional 3 personnel would come out at this time, and as this squad from this vehicle was entering this area to clear this building, this squad was preparing to move alongside it as they cleared the inside of the building. As that happened, these personnel fired from around the corner, but were quickly liquidated by heavy fire from the 30mm autocannon, which hit the ground and blew them to pieces with HE ammunition, while there was also small arms fire returned, as indicated by the cyan color coding as there was back and forth between this squad and these personnel. As the squad would then breach this building and begin to clear it out, this squad moved slightly around the corner initially, while this squad cleared this building. A loitering munitions strike had already occurred on the top of this building, as there had been sharpshooters of the armed reactionary civilian variety laying on top of this building, trying to take shots at the vehicles and personnel coming out from them, only to be destroyed as soon as the CH-901A loitering munitions entered the fray. With their AI target-seeking mode heavily influenced by certain factors, including high ground, such as on top of buildings or on higher terrain, these were primary targets of loitering munition strikes, and a single loitering munition slammed into these personnel, wiping them out. Other loitering munitions would hit personnel in these fields, in this area, in the crevices, and the natural formations from wadis and washouts, gradually thinning out their numbers, along with the heavy fire from the light tanks as they moved up. As the light tanks moved in, they also had already destroyed these technicals, two in this parking lot of this restaurant, and another two on the road itself, having had wiped them out with their 105mm high-velocity rifled tank guns, simply blasting them to pieces with Frag-T ammunition, which was more than enough to destroy these civilian vehicles. They also, as they moved into the area, would fire at these armed reactionary civilians who had come by the road laying alongside of it with a few Molotov cocktails ready to Molotov the lead tank, only they would never succeed in this because not only were they fired at by the lead light tank with a Frag-T shell in this area, another loitering munition strike also came in and hit them, as they were not as well protected in this position as were the personnel that were hiding out in the earthen crevices, who were now continuing to lay down small arms fire, trying to pick off the turret machine gunners as best as possible. However, they would fail miserably, as they were up against 105mm high-velocity rifled tank guns, mainly using Frag-T ammunition in this, but also HE shells, alongside of heavy machine gun fire from the turret machine gunners laying down 12.7mm fire, as well as even coaxial machine gun fire coming from the 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine guns adjacent to the main guns. Alongside of the fire coming in from the light tanks, again, there were sporadic strikes from loitering munitions on certain positions, coming straight down on the heads of some of the numbers, but the armed reactionary civilians were spread all throughout this area, and there were over 600 of them, and this effectively was such a target-rich environment. Even all 48 of the loitering munitions from the initial volley would not be enough to eliminate all of these personnel. Again, it would be up to the dismounted armored infantry, PAP troops, alongside of their vehicle support, and later to come artillery support, as well as the two firing batteries, one Type 83 122mm howitzer battery, and their single Type 59-IR-1 130mm towed howitzer battery, would open fire by 1:30 a.m. as the battle had started at 12:45 a.m., or 45 minutes into the nationwide invasion. 45 minutes into the battle would be when the artillery strikes would begin, and they would be highly precise and surgical to eliminate the remaining armed civilian personnel in the area. Again, there would also be surgical air support from both the Iranian Air Force and the PLAAF, or the Chinese Air Force, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, contributing a strike aircraft each, an Su-24, and a JH-7 to help finish off the stragglers in this area. The initial airstrike would come in only 15 minutes into this battle by 1 a.m., when a single Su-24 would be diverted to drop 4,000 pounds as single 1,000-pound munitions onto targets below, attempting to flee the battle space. This would help to fix the rest who witnessed this in place, making them want to seek cover throughout the industrial facility, whether inside of the buildings or outside among the different features, such as the heavy equipment, storage containers, as well as the T-walls and other types of walls located throughout this facility. There are even trailers on these industrial sites which served as mobile offices for the oil companies who had office facilities in this area. There were also larger office buildings as well, which would need to be cleared out by the People's Armed Police Shock Forces, as armed reactionary civilians, having had dismounted from their technicals, would flee into these larger buildings as well, as other armed reactionary civilians would fight to cross the street to engage the People's Armed Police dismounts as they would enter the area. They would attack with many different weapons, whether bolt-action rifles, like so, as well as also even pump shotguns, which were worthless in this type of combat, and also, again, sporting rifles, or effectively the civilian market versions of military rifles, semi-automatic, which effectively was no different than a military rifle, other than the lack of a 3-round burst option for the AR and a fully automatic option for the AKs. As there were so many different ammunition types in play, even if these forces had been organized properly, logistics would have been a nightmare. Getting the proper ammunition for the proper weapons in such a situation would have produced an immense amount of chaos and additional combat stress added to the situation as a whole. 2 People's Armed Police squads would even scale and then rappel down a concrete T-wall, completely and totally surprising the armed reactionary civilians waiting on the other side, as the People's Armed Police not only had their small arms available, but also even heavier weapons such as their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, even a single squad member in each squad possessing a grenade tube for 35mm grenades beneath their QBZ-95 rifles. Of course, they had a light machine gunner in each squad possessing the QBJ-201 light machine gun, and HJ-08 anti-tank guided missiles. Many of the ammunition for these systems, or the systems themselves, were kept in decent supply within the combat vehicles of the armored infantry themselves. As they entered, they had ample ammunition for their Type 69 Chinese rocket-propelled grenade systems, whether anti-personnel or anti-armor rounds. They also possessed their HJ-08 anti-tank guided missiles. They had crates of 35mm grenades, and of course, if need be, they had a member in each squad trained to use the most devastating weapon of all, and a favorite of the PAP, their Type 73 flamethrower system, which was extremely devastating in combat and produced a massive psychological effect that couldn't be quantified, as the enemy was utterly horrified of being incinerated alive by this weapon system. As the first buildings were in the process of being cleared out by the 1st platoon, or the lead platoon of the Armored Infantry Company, they would rush through these buildings in their stack team formations, as each squad would break down into 2 half squads, and they would enter these offices and industrial buildings and rapidly clear them, utilizing tactical formations as they proceeded through the halls and the lobbies and the rooms of these buildings. By now, as it was 1 a.m., the Armored Infantry Company had fully come underneath I-20 and made their way to this position, as these personnel had been wiped out and these buildings cleared in the sanitation/waste truck facility here. These groupings had come out of this office, as these were oil company offices along these roads that proceeded through the facilities, and they were heavily mowed down by both the heavy machine guns and the 30mm autocannon of the lead infantry fighting vehicle, the Type 86G, and the Type 63s with their heavy machine guns. At this point in time, as these 2 squads had bounded to this position after destroying these personnel, they then had bounded further to clear this office for these oil tanks, these oil containers, and the rail platform here for onloading and offloading supplies for these industries. They would clear this particular office building here, moving through in their stack teams, albeit finding no enemies at this time. They would then prepare to continue on to the rail platform, where they would each break into their individual squads, as at this point in time this squad was following this squad to reach this building while these vehicles proceeded onward. These technicals had rushed forward along with these personnel coming out behind these storage tanks and getting utterly mowed down as a result as well by the vehicle-based fires. At this time, the squad that had cleared this building had come out to this gate and was laying down heavy fire on these forces as they moved up to the corner while this was happening. And they, laying down heavy fire, enabled this squad that moved outside of the building according to standard building clearance procedures. As this squad cleared it, this squad now bounded to this position here and prepared to scale this chain link fence after wiping these personnel out who tried to meet them at this position, trying to break their way through to get to these buildings for safety and cover. They were mowed down by the squad, and the squad bounded and closed with them to hand grenade range and finished off the last few stragglers of these personnel. This squad, having first cleared this building, then cleared this building, and prepared to move alongside this concrete T-wall separating this deserty field from this compound, this industrial compound, as these forces could not directly exchange fire with these forces through the concrete T-wall here. This squad moved without having to worry about taking fire from these personnel and prepared to cross this chain link fence here to this pumping station where they would take cover and lay down fire on these personnel to support this squad bounding across the fence to clear this building after they had wiped these personnel out, and this squad had moved and wiped these personnel out. This squad would remain outside of the building to provide covering fire as this squad cleared the building, and then would move to clear this building, while this squad held their position to offer covering fire to allow them to clear this office here, as they would move through and again find no enemy personnel in these buildings, at least for the time being. So there were still enemy personnel elsewhere throughout this compound. Heavy fighting would continue as the remaining two combat platoons of the Armored Infantry Company would be dropped off to attain the main prize of the entire operation, which was effectively the capture and clearance of the oil reclamation facility itself, as this facility was highly critical to colonial operations in this region after the conquest of the United States and the colonization thereof. This oil reclamation facility was effectively there to remove impurities from oil, and similar to oil recycling in some aspects, it was effectively there to ensure that the oil was pure and ready for transport to produce into fuels. As this plant was highly coveted by the coalition, it was imperative that it be taken in a highly surgical manner with little to no damage done to the facilities themselves in the process. As this was already in the works, the surrounding areas were also in the process of being cleared, including the southeastern quadrant, where the Light Tank Company was in heavy combat engaging armed reactionary civilians in their makeshift ad hoc nature-created trench systems and foxhole systems, their wadis and washouts, some of which were deep crevices in the earth where they could take adequate cover from incoming tank shells and heavy machine gun fire, while others were slightly shorter crevices where they didn't have as much cover but still had enough to keep them relatively safe, at least for the time. However, some had been thinned out by strikes from loitering munitions that had come in earlier in the fighting and slammed into some of their positions right on top of their heads. And soon, later in the battle, this would be joined by artillery fire and even, again, a JH-7 airstrike, dropping 2 cluster munitions as well as 4 1,000-pound air-to-ground munitions to annihilate any remaining forces that were holed up in this area without also destroying the oil derricks in the process, as these were also wanted intact. As this was going on here, the fire being laid down into these personnel, they continued to try to resist, but they too were gradually being thinned out. Some fired from their technicals, others fired outside of their technicals, and this was an exchange of back and forth fire. And some fire now, after this office was cleared, was coming out the window towards these personnel. As that was happening, these vehicles had by now moved to this position, while these squads moved alongside of them for protection, as their vehicles and these two squads can mutually support one another. And they broke into their two squads to defend this platform and these oil storage tank facilities here, while this light tank company remained in the north of I-20 to protect the operation from the north. Effectively, if there were any more armed reactionary civilians, they could effectively stop them from entering this area as a sort of ad hoc makeshift reinforcement. However, due to no actionable intelligence being able to be gathered by this massive, chaotic cluster of armed reactionary civilians. They didn't know what was going on around them. They had no idea where the exact positions of enemy forces were at any given time, as they were deep in the facility, and they had no idea that they were in the process of being surrounded, as this light tank company had already moved here and had fields of fire cutting off escape from the south towards the southeast as well as east. This armored infantry company now dropping off 2nd and 3rd platoon, which moved into position right outside their vehicles and dropped in the prone position, and would effectively bound and cover deep into the facility as they would fight their way in. As they would do at first short bounding and covering moves where one squad would lay down heavy fire while the other moved as they would give supporting fire. Then they would get up and move ahead of them, drop, lay down fire, and then that other squad would get up, and it would be like a leapfrogging effect towards the heart of the facility in order to ensure that it was cleared of all armed resistance. The shock and surprise of this attack, the armed reactionary civilians, upon entering the facility, had very little time to try to organize themselves in any way, shape, or form, and effectively fought in isolated groups, which again caused friendly fire incidences at times because they knew not exactly where enemy forces were at any given moment. As now, as the chaos was getting worse, these armed reactionary civilians in this parking area, taking cover behind anything they could, whether it was parked abandoned vehicles, heavy equipment, or whether it was behind storage containers, were in the process of being mopped up by the People's Armed Police shock troops. As the armored infantry troops bounded ahead, they cleared these enemy forces and even received some fire support from the vehicles of their platoons, as the 2nd and 3rd platoon vehicles were in a line following the wedge formation of the 1st platoon in a rolling arrow. As they move and smash through this chain link fencing here, they entered the oil valve facility on the west of the main prize. As they moved south, these forces that had moved ahead were slaughtered by heavy fire from the vehicles and from the 2 squads of 2nd platoon that were on this side here, that were on the western side. As they bounded and covered tactically, they slaughtered these forces with aid from their vehicles. As their vehicles did take some fire, they eliminated these forces along with their dismounted infantry, while the 2 squads did short bounds, and then the next squads bounded ahead as they laid down covering fire. This continued until they reached the oil reclamation facility itself. 3rd platoon did much the same, as they had to aid in the clearance of the sizable oil reclamation plant. These forces had tried to move in this position here, and this technical tried to move around to lay down fire in a sort of L vector of fire, as these trucks had retreated to the very back of the plant by this point as they were taking fire. They would eventually be destroyed by heavy artillery shelling as the time was drawing near when the artillery would join in at 1:30 a.m. By the time the vehicles were now beginning to move through this area, it was now at the stroke of 1:30. These vehicles here and these personnel had all been hit earlier by the immense volley of loitering munitions, as 48 of them covered this battle space and struck various targets throughout, including these vehicles and personnel here that dismounted their personnel from their technicals in this area. They were all wiped out by loitering munition strikes, as well as here, and some in these crevices were hit directly on top. And again, the sharpshooters on top of this building here were wiped out by loitering munition strikes. Even these 3 technicals that were initially stragglers trying to get into the area were also struck and destroyed on this access road by loitering munitions. And now, as the squads bounded and covered into the area, they prepared to clear out each and every structure on the oil reclamation plant, as this squad would clear this office alongside of this roadway here, and then this squad would bound and cover outside of the buildings according to building clearance procedures, as this squad in the center of 2nd platoon would clear this office, while these 2 squads would bound and cover ahead. This after these personnel here tried to move alongside the building to attack, as well as these personnel with 2nd platoon effectively eradicating these remaining forces, those not in red that had been destroyed by loitering munition strikes, carried out this attack. And 2nd and 3rd platoon wiped them out in the process, as indicated by these cyan-colored arrows. Completely encapsulated in red means they were destroyed. As these vehicles, again, had all fled this area a bit earlier, they were now being pounded heavily by the incoming artillery strikes from both 122 millimeter howitzer fire coming from the allocated 122 millimeter Type 83 howitzer battery involved in this operation to support this battle, as well as also the Type 59-I or -1 howitzer battery laying down fire throughout this facility as well, with 130 millimeter shell fire, which was slightly more powerful. Now, these personnel in this area were being heavily struck by this immense volume of shell fire as it landed and splashed all throughout this area, blasting technicals and personnel in them to abject, ripped up ruination into oblivion. At this point in time, as some personnel again tried to cross these roads in the facility to attack the advancing People's Armed Police, they were mowed down in the process as the PAP shock troops in their prone position laid down heavy supporting fire for other squads to advance ahead of them to do the same thing to allow them to continue to advance forward. And it initially again started as short bounds, but ended up becoming longer bounds as they gradually fought their way into the facility and cleared all the enemy personnel out of it. As again, they had total ISR dominance, total communications dominance, and were able to see every single solitary enemy position on the map. They got the complete and total drop on the American forces, again, some of which had even wiped each other out in friendly fire incidences, again, due to a variety of causes. Again, no communication, no ISR capabilities to acquire actionable intelligence to formulate a coherent defensive plan for the area, no organization coordination, no centralized leadership, no logistical capabilities to speak of. It was effectively at the bare minimum in that category. And it was a free-for-all, again, as mentioned before, which led to these personnel getting into firefights with one another at times. It was a very chaotic situation. This was the real world. This was not fantasy. This was not effectively fighting off a well-armored, well-armed military or paramilitary force at your own home. These personnel thought that they could come in and defend this facility adequately, but because there was no organization, communication, coordination, no ISR, no communications, and no logistics, everything broke down quickly. This is real life. The PAP, again, had every advantage, and they utilized it to the extreme as they fought their way through this facility. By now, everything was beginning to fall apart as these personnel and their technicals were destroyed by heavy fire coming from the PAP squads of 3rd Platoon, the two squads to the furthest east. As they bounded and covered, they laid down heavy fire into these personnel as they moved to cross this street in this area. They were just simply mowed down by heavy fire, as again, many of them didn't even have body armor or even plate carriers. However, some did, but it was simply not enough. And as a result, it was vastly easier to annihilate these personnel, as even certain wounds could be fatal as they had no protection. Their torsos lay completely open to everything from standard bullets to hand grenades, shrapnel, and shrapnel from other devastating weapons. In short order, it would almost be over for these armed civilians who had no idea what they were getting themselves into, as there were tens of millions of armed civilians who were intelligent and wise and knew they needed to get out of the combat zone in order to regroup and prepare themselves. The armed reactionary civilians who rose up in their various neighborhoods and their various human settlements, which were cities of different sizes and rural towns even, they rose up in their hundreds to their thousands, and even some areas their tens of thousands, and were slaughtered as a result. As again, all of the conditions that existed for this particular group of armed reactionary civilians existed across the board for armed reactionary civilians everywhere, who left their homes with weapons in hand and tried to fight the invaders. They were simply crushed. As again, this group did have personnel within it that put together Molotov cocktails out of using gasoline tanks, empty bottles, and handkerchiefs or other cloth for a fuse mechanism. They would never be able to effectively use these weapons in this battle because the People's Armed Police dismounted infantry were clearing the facility and effectively defending their vehicles in the process. As this is a well-planned and well-executed operation, these forces stood no chance. As the vehicles moved by this building, the artillery strikes began to pummel this area, blasting technicals and personnel to pieces. As these personnel had earlier charged at the vehicles when they were moving through this area, the remainder were wiped out as they tried to hide behind these buildings, and the vehicles were beginning to come around as well and lay down fire by the time they reached this corner. The lead infantry fighting vehicle pumping out 30mm autocannon ammunition and blasting these personnel and their technicals along with heavy artillery strikes to pieces. These personnel trying to flee towards the back of the plant, deciding that it was more prudent to escape altogether, such as this earlier group that had been pounded by airstrikes. They decided to take the risk, and as they left the oil valve pump plant, they were heavily pounded by 130mm strikes coming in from the artillery battery of the Type 59-I or -1 howitzers. They were completely inundated by shell fire. They were simply wiped off the map in the literal and proverbial sense. By that time, the vehicles had reached this point and would continue on towards the back of the plant, by which point the 2 platoons dropped off to sweep the entire oil reclamation plant were well in the process of so doing, as these offices were in the process of being cleared out by the different squads according to standard building clearance procedures, with some squads of the platoons remaining outside while the others cleared the buildings in order to prevent anyone from escaping, enabling them to cut them down or to be used as reinforcements to enter the building if need be, if something were to go wrong inside. By this point, many of these buildings had been abandoned. However, there would be bigger buildings with enemy personnel still holed up inside towards the back of the plant. As it was now going on 2 a.m., we're effectively an hour and 15 minutes into the battle. The buildings on the oil reclamation plant were now beginning to be fully cleared, as these personnel here had escaped from the advancing PAP forces. They went deeper into the oil reclamation plant and would try to put up resistance by a series of tanks and would end up being wiped out in the process, as they thought they were protected, relatively speaking, by this concrete T-wall, enabling them to turn around and eliminate any threat entering this area by these massive storage tanks. They would be horribly wrong as they fled rapidly into this area to take up fighting positions throughout it. The People's Armed Police would surprise them by scaling the concrete T-walls and coming down on the other side as they would rappel their way down, and would enter the area in an extremely aggressive and rapid manner and strike avidly and vigorously against the defending forces holed up in this area. All of this combat, though it was effectively decisive for the PAP in terms of their operation overall against these armed civilians, would suffer some minor casualties, some serious enough to warrant the arrival of their service support company's flying platoon's Z-8 utility helicopter, which would be utilized in the medevac capacity as a single Z-8 of the flying platoon of 5 helos from the service support company at the division level would have their flight surgeon and combat medics aboard in order to take in the seriously wounded as well as pick up KIAs and fly them back to the medical surgical hospital they had underground on their CCP regime property directly south of the Midland International Air and Spaceport, safely tucked away in the outer wilderness of this battle space, along with the headquarters and headquarters company of the whole division, which was the command and administrative elements over the entire division of both brigades, which were now in combat throughout this entire area. As the service support company played a critical role, especially in medical operations for the entire division at the division level, they handled the most serious of the casualties at their medical surgical hospital. And as they would fly into this area by the headquarters platoon's position of the light tank company, combat medics would bring their worst wounded to this position, as there was an armored ambulance for less critically wounded in the two headquarters platoons of each company in battle, the armored infantry company and the light tank company. The light tank company would actually have a critically wounded turret gunner, and even one ending up as a KIA that would have to be medevaced. These would be the only two casualties from the entire company, from the light tank company, while the armored infantry troops, as they carried out the bulk of the clearance operations, would lose 5 troops as KIAs, and they would have another 8, and several of them would be critically wounded enough to warrant a flight out of the battle space aboard the Z-8 utility helicopter. Fighting was now winding down in the area. There were only a few main pockets of resistance that needed to be mopped up, 2 of which were in large office buildings. One was an office building slash storage building combo with garage doors to store heavy equipment in the area, combined with an office, and the other was simply just another office type building. As 25 were holed up in the smaller office and there were 40 holed up in the larger building, 3 PAP squads from 2nd Platoon would be tasked with the capture and clearance of this building, while there would be a single squad to carry out the clearance and capture of this building, this office, on the eastern side, while the western side had more enemies in their building and it was a larger building. Another squad moving up alongside the road that led to the back of the facility, as a gate was right here, was moving up alongside the fencing and these massive tanks, storage tanks, while these 2 squads had cleared this wall, this large concrete T-wall, again, rappelling down and clearing this office and this area near additional tanks by a pumping station, wherein the earlier fleeing defending forces had moved to take cover to return fire if anyone came through this area, but the shock and surprise of the repelling actually aided in the quick eradication of these forces in this area, allowing for this squad to move outside of these buildings as they were being cleared in this pumping station. And then, as the squad would move to guard this gate, these personnel having a drawn-out firefight with these individuals finally ended when a massive artillery strike had come in earlier, just after 1:30 a.m. rather, and artillery was also now beginning to drop on the heads of the remaining stragglers taking cover in the earthen crevices in the southeast quadrant of the map, while they were still under heavy fire as well from the light tanks, firing Frag T shells, heavy machine gun fire, even some HE shells, and coax machine gun fire. Again, the crevices being so deep and some thin enough where they could get down and the shells wouldn't even hit them, enabled them to survive up to this point. However, this would be short-lived now, as artillery could be vectored directly on top of these crevices with pinpoint precision, and not only that, but an airstrike would come in short order, as by 2:20 a.m., this airstrike would officially end the entire battle, as a JH-7 would swoop in, drop 2 of its devastating cluster munitions, in addition to 4 1,000-pound precision munitions on the tops of these creviced areas. completely eradicating the targets below, in addition to the immense artillery strikes. Some of the technicals earlier had gotten into these crevices, as some of them were wide enough to shield the technicals, but they were destroyed quickly by earlier strikes from loitering munitions as they were picked out, especially as the vehicles were considered higher priority targets and were destroyed along with personnel immediately adjacent to them, but others survived and continued to fight against the light tanks, gradually being whittled down until the artillery came in and the massive airstrike to finish them off. As this squad again had moved to guard this gate, this squad breached this building as this squad moved up to provide covering fire, and then they moved up into this area here while the squad was clearing this building as they remained outside to give support. And then the squad, after eliminating the 25 defenders inside, would prepare to clear the final building at the very end of this particular site. These vehicles had all been destroyed just after 1:30 a.m. in the artillery strikes that had come in upon them. Dozens of personnel were immediately wiped out in this small convoy that tried to reach the back of the facility, allowing for these troops to move up into these positions to clear these buildings, by which point, as this building had been cleared out, the last building was cleared, as these personnel had all been wiped out earlier by loitering munition strikes entering the area, slamming into their technicals and personnel that were immediately around them, and wiping them all out in the process. As the squad now breached the last building from 3rd Platoon on this side of the facility, 2nd Platoon was now in the process of clearing the large building toward the back of the facility on its southwestern end. As this squad that cleared this building, these had all again been destroyed by loitering munition strikes earlier, and this squad now moving into this position would support the squad clearing this building, while this 3rd Platoon squad here and this 3rd Platoon squad would bound and cover tactically alongside this fence and alongside the building, as two squads would be effectively immediately outside the building for support. This squad would remain by the fence to watch this way, as this squad breached the building with a squad on either side moving up alongside of the building as this squad gradually cleared it out. These two squads bounded and covered on either side of a chain link fence with one another toward the back of both the oil valve plant and this oil reclamation plant. As they bounded and covered, they could take larger bounds, as all the enemies had been wiped out by artillery strikes, and of course earlier by loitering munition strikes, and the rest destroyed as they tried to attack the PAP forces entering the plant. And others yet still had even cut one another down inadvertently in friendly fire incidences, as mentioned previously. It was a totally chaotic and devastating assault, and not only because of the coalition's distinct advantages, but also because a massive grouping of armed reactionary civilians in real-life conditions would never be able to fight properly as any type of cohesive force because of their lack of organization, coordination, centralized command, logistical capabilities, as some even ran out of ammo a bit prematurely, even tried to surrender and were wiped out by the brutal PAP. And all of these conditions combined with a lack of ISR and actionable intelligence and communication led to them being thoroughly annihilated in a very decisive manner. At least it could be said with their militia brethren, which were far better organized, even better armed with heavy weapons, which could actually create some PAP casualties, as they had better weaponry than simple small arms. The armed militiamen, even though they too had been thrown into the Stone Age, had centralized command. They had designated scouting groups that would acquire intelligence, albeit very slowly compared to drones and other forms of rapid ISR gathering. They had organized medical staff. They had, again, the means to form cohesive plans as they gathered actionable intelligence, as they had an intelligence section that would manage the information flow. They also had a proper, capable logistical system that served them well, as they had standardized ammunition and they had standardized weapons for their ammunition, enabling the delivery of ammunition to never be chaotic, as they would always deliver the correct ammunition for the correct weapons. This was a critical factor in battle, as if you were to deliver the wrong ammunition, you certainly could not use it. The armed reactionary civilians, on the other hand, looked like a mass of bumbling fools compared to their militia brethren. So they were just a hodgepodge of random armed civilians that were acting of their own volition in their own ways as they saw fit, making this a free-for-all, causing them all to get eradicated quickly and decisively by the highly disciplined, highly gung-ho, highly aggressive, highly tactically skilled People's Armed Police shock troops, which mowed them down in the dozens as they advanced into the plant, even using superior surprise tactics such as scaling walls and rappelling on the other side to get the drop on the defenders, who had no expectation of this occurring, as they had their weapons trained on certain entry points. They never thought that the PAP brought rappelling equipment with them, which they did, as they had all knowledge acquired at every second on this facility through their ISR apparatus. They knew where all the walls were, they knew the entire plant layout, they knew everything about the place, and thus planned accordingly, with the two squads bringing their repelling ropes along. Clearing out the final 40 personnel in the large building in the southwest would take a bit of time, as they had begun just before 2 a.m. to clear this particular building, having to move through its large storage garage-like facilities before reaching the office facilities within the same building. The 40 personnel inside put up the best fight they could with what they had, although again, every single solitary building floor plan was known by the intelligence gathered through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, or the Sino-Russian AI combat cloud, enabling the PAP to never have to worry about surprises, as they knew the entire building layout and where personnel could be hiding at any given time, enabling them to never have to worry about corners or certain rooms, as they knew where every room and every corner was in a building, and every crevice that could be used as a hiding spot by the defenders. This enabled them to never have to worry again about surprises when raiding, breaching, and clearing buildings. As the final building would be cleared just before 2:20 a.m., as the battle ended at 2:20 a.m., and the building would be cleared roughly 5 minutes beforehand, the last airstrike would come in by the powerful JH-7 strike aircraft, dropping its potent payload on the deserty fields below, where the earthen crevices, for at least a short time, had protected a decent number of the defending forces. The combination of this powerful JH-7 airstrike, along with the artillery strikes effectively being pinpoint accurate, landing in these crevices on the very tops of many of their heads, finishing off the already thinned out defenders, enabled this battle to, for all intents and purposes, come to an end, as also they were still, again, continually taking fire from the light tanks at this time. everything from Frag T shells to coax machine gun fire to heavy machine gun fire from the turret gunners. If anyone tried to get up and out of these crevices to flee the area, they were simply cut down by the fire from the light tanks if they tried to move because they saw artillery fire striking other areas. And again, the airstrike would finish off the remaining stragglers as well, at least on this southern portion of the battlefield. As these buildings had all been cleared, including this building, these squads all having moved up to their final positions within these facilities, the vehicles and troops controlled the entire oil reclamation plant, now completely cleared of all armed resisting forces. Again, the medevac had by this point come to pick up the horribly wounded, or the severe WIAs, as well as the small number of KIAs in this particular battle. As this critical objective was now formally in the hands of the People's Armed Police, this could now be implemented in their colonial planning post-invasion, as this would only be, overall, a simple 4-day-long invasion, as this country was in no way, shape, form, or facet prepared for this type of invasion, as fourth-generation warfare doctrines were effectively the death knell for the United States of America, as they were being attacked from within and from without simultaneously. The dreams of the CCP regime to have their vast wealth from their overseas colony was about to be put into effect, as the various coalition forces, primarily of China, but also of their allies, such as Russia, the second largest overall contributor to this invasion, as well as all of the second-tier powers that contributed forces, some would stay while others would go after the invasion had concluded. Some had just signed on to the Sino-Russian coalition for revenge and would leave after the invasion had ended, while others would stay as they would be rewarded for continuing the war against the soon-to-come massive insurgency or partisan uprising, their war of liberation, self-liberation. The Chinese would wage a brutal war of colonization, occupation, and repression against the American people for many years to come. This would be one of the longest wars ever fought in all human history, as it pertained to the war of occupation / war of self-liberation that was to be fought on this massive landmass. As objectives were falling one by one throughout the Midland and Odessa battle space, as the gung-ho, jingoistic, ultra-nationalist, extremely patriotic, but also extremely pro-CCP regime PAP shock forces took each and every objective and crushed all opposition. There were only a few remaining major objectives left, now that many had already fallen, which was the complete and thorough clearance of the city of Midland, which was to become one of the two main red zones, or fortified colonial settlement zones, for the incoming colonists who would work and live in this area from China, as well as the city of Odessa. And there would be pockets of resistance throughout the city in Odessa and also in Midland that would have to be crushed. Not only this, but the rural countryside would have to be completely and totally pacified, as there were two remaining militias to contend with in the rural hinterlands of Odessa particularly. The strongest of the 7 militias in this region on the map would have to be crushed, and a long-lasting battle would ensue in the far southwest quadrant of the map to pacify their home base area as it pertained to this militia. There was a smaller militia in the northwest that would also have to be contended with in order to ensure the protection of the recently captured Ector County Energy Power Plant, which was also a major objective and needed to be held at all costs by the PAP, and thus they would need to destroy this militia to ensure its safety. However, the main objectives of the red zones of Midland and Odessa now needed to be captured and pacified of all armed resistance. There were still American alphabet paramilitary branches located in Midland, but also even in Odessa, as there were different personnel from these branches that needed to be eradicated by the PAP. as well as also standard armed reactionary civilians now rising up in these areas, coming out of hiding, as well as also militia members that had fled and survived the initial contact with the PAP in the far northeast of the battle space as it pertained to Midland. These forces would have to be brutally crushed, as the first forces, due to the light mechanized infantry battalions of the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division's 2 brigades being the fastest available forces due to their wheeled combat vehicles, they were able to enter Midland first, as well as also clear their own flanks, which would actually continue occurring concurrently as the 6 of 7 armored light mechanized infantry companies, would race into the heart of the city and begin to capture key sites and clear them of armed resistance within the city of Midland, and would also receive support from an armored battalion, which would move in along with them, albeit slower, as the wheeled vehicles were far faster moving and could get places much quicker. They were utilized in this capacity to rapidly strike inside of Midland and use their speed advantage for the shock and surprise factor, as there were many important buildings that needed to be captured within the heart of Midland, and it was up to these light mechanized infantry troops to carry it out, as they would again receive powerful support from an armored battalion within the 2nd Brigade as it pertained to the Midland side of the battle space. They would enter in just behind the light mechanized infantry battalion in order to aid in the capture and clearance of the city of Midland. Guerrilla warfare tactics would be utilized heavily in defense of Midland, including its key buildings that were wanted by the PAP, and a somewhat long-running battle, at least in terms of the scope and scale of this invasion, would occur inside of the city, as 2 pockets of resistance would arise therein and would have to be brutally crushed by these 2 battalions. As a single light mechanized infantry company from the light mechanized infantry battalion was clearing its own flanks while the other 6 combat companies raced in order to clear this militia out of the way so that the headquarters and support company of their whole battalion could run supplies in and also command the operation of their battalion's combat companies from their CCP property. The nearby armored battalion, by this point, was already in the process of moving toward the city, as the 6 light mechanized infantry companies followed one another to race to the heart of the city. In the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines, the battle for the city of Midland will be covered. A hodgepodge of defending forces would be waiting for them inside. Everything from well-equipped, well-trained, and well-armed civilian militia forces who earlier fled into the city, co-joined by American alphabet paramilitary forces, as well as also being co-joined even by standard armed reactionary civilians who also entered the area by emerging from their homes and into the heart of the city. There would be 2 pockets of resistance, mostly, that would have to be contended with and brutally suppressed, as the PAP would enter these areas and clear them accordingly. More to come in the next video.